What if I told you that a wedding from almost 450 years ago could totally change how you think about progress and inclusion? Seriously, this is a story about a vow so powerful it challenged the very definition of what it meant to be a person in the eyes of the law. Let's dive in. So, in early 2026, Leicester Cathedral is going to celebrate a pretty big anniversary. And no, not 50 years, we're talking 450. We're going all the way back to 1576 to witness a wedding that was so unusual, it was basically immortalized in the history books. You see, the groom was a blacksmith named Thomas Tilsey, and he was deaf. The local parish clerk was so blown away by this that he actually documented every single moment of the ceremony, a wedding that was done not with spoken words but completely with hands. Now, when you hear that, it's so easy to see this story as this one-off, heartwarming moment of progress, something way ahead of its time. But the truth is, it's a lot more complex and, frankly, way more interesting than that. Tilsey's wedding wasn't some kind of first. It was actually the result of a legal tradition that was already centuries old. Okay, so to really get why this wedding was even possible, we have to go back and look at the central legal fight that the deaf community had been facing for centuries, the fight to just be seen as capable of giving consent. And this is where you see this huge clash of ideas. On one hand, you've got ancient Roman and Aristotelian law, which pretty cruelly argued that if you couldn't speak, you couldn't think intelligently. This basically treated deaf individuals like they were perpetual children. But then, on the other hand, way back in 1198, the medieval church made a statement that was absolutely revolutionary. A vow made with signs is just as valid as one that's spoken. And if you want to know just how extreme that older view was, listen to this quote from a 17th century barrister. The logic was that a deaf person couldn't even be held responsible for a crime, not even murder, because they were seen as totally incapable of understanding right from wrong. They just had no legal standing at all. And that's why the Pope's decree in 1198 was such a game changer. It wasn't just about marriage. It was about something so much bigger: legal personhood. Think about it. If the church recognizes your ability to consent to a marriage, then the law kind of has to recognize your right to do other things, like inherit property, testify in court, and just be a full participant in society. So Thomas Tilsey's wedding in 1576, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was standing on the shoulders of a long, and for the most part, totally silent legal history. And you can literally trace this history unfolding over centuries. It all starts with that papal decree back in 1198. Then, fast forward to 1344, and we have a record of a deaf man in an English court, using sign language to defend his own property. All of this is what paved the way for Thomas Tilsey's wedding, almost 400 years after that first decree. And this recognition went way beyond just weddings. I mean, law students were actually being taught that signs were legally binding for contracts. Priests were accepting confessions made completely through gestures. There were even these structured sign systems, kind of like home signs, being used in royal courts to include deaf members of the nobility in everyday life. This was an established part of the landscape. Now, legal history can feel a little abstract, right? But you know what brings it to life? A good old-fashioned, high-stakes family drama. Okay, so let me tell you about Thomas Speller. He was a deaf apprentice who, in 1618, fell in love with his boss's daughter, Sarah. Well, his mother, Winifred, was absolutely furious, mostly because the marriage would mean her allowance from him would get cut off. So she did everything she could to stop it, claiming her son was being tricked and was mentally incapable of consenting to marriage. But here's the thing. The law was on Thomas's side. The bishop's lawyer interviewed him, and Thomas, using his signs, proved he knew exactly what he was doing and who he wanted to marry. The lawyer overruled the mother, the license was issued, and that law from way back in 1198 protected his right to choose his own partner. So all of this sounds incredibly progressive, doesn't it? Well, yeah, it was. But it came with a pretty big asterisk. The legal right was there on paper, but how it was applied in real life, that was far from perfect. Which brings us to a really crucial question. When Thomas Tilsey, our blacksmith, was standing there at the altar, was he actually being allowed to communicate freely, or was he just being asked to put on a performance for a hearing audience? This is what historians call the mime barrier. See, Tilsey couldn't just use his normal, everyday signs. First, he had to audition for the authorities to prove he was intelligent. Then, during the actual ceremony, he had to use this set of exaggerated, pre-approved gestures. It was more like charades, really, just so the hearing people in the audience could understand. It wasn't about his ability to consent. It was about making the hearing world feel comfortable. And this leaves us with a fascinating and maybe a little uncomfortable thought. This story shows us a world that was, in some ways, surprisingly advanced. A 400-year-old law gave Thomas Tilsley the right to marry who he wanted, but he still had to perform his identity in a way that catered to the hearing world. It really makes you wonder, what invisible mind barriers still exist today? What rules or expectations are we putting on people that 450 years from now will look just as strange?